All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I see some familiar faces from the last two parts of this webinar that we've done. So welcome back if you are rejoining us for part three. This is going to cover really building your EPM strategy and roadmap this session. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Yana. I'm the marketing director at US Analytics. We are a leading national EPM and analytics service firm. We refer to ourselves as the picture results company, empowering the finance office to drive strategy and results. We've been in this industry for over 20 years, so we have a lot of experience doing what we do, and we love helping you all achieve your business and finance goals. So again, as I mentioned, today's webinar is the conclusion of a three-part series on everything EPM Cloud. This part will really cover how to build your roadmap, what top considerations and pitfalls that you might encounter in doing so, and how we can help you guys as being a resource and extension of your team. Today's speaker is Doug Hahn. Doug is the VP of Professional Services at US Analytics. He has a lot of experience, 27 plus years of experience in IT, 15 in consulting, and 10 being an executive in this space. He's a former CIO, so he, again, from that perspective and leadership perspective, he really understands how your technologies need to all work collectively together with business goals in mind, right? And then how that impacts your teams and managing your teams. So he'll be covering a lot of those things today. It's a really great presentation. So do make sure that you stick all the way through. Make sure that you're asking questions as we go through the content, and then we'll do an in-depth Q&A at the very end.
Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when and where you're listening to this webinar. I really do appreciate those who are on the call live with us and your polling questions. They do help me tailor the presentation to make sure that I'm addressing. Sounds like we got a lot of Hyperion users that are currently trying to understand the next 6 to 12 months or maybe later what their EPM roadmap may look like. And so hopefully this will be some really good insight for you on what are some of the considerations you need to be thinking about, and ultimately whether or not your organization makes that decision or not, you'll be prepared for that. So before I kind of get started, I want to kind of just lay out that what this session is and is not. I want to provide you a lot of information, a lot of documentation, and a lot of examples from real life world about other people's progression to the EPM cloud and some of the considerations you need to be taking into consideration. But I want to preface that this is not a one-size-fits-all template that you can just drop in and do an implementation. There's a lot of steps involved, there's a lot of considerations involved, and it's very unique to your use case. It could be very unique to your industry. It could be very unique to the customizations that you have in Hyperion or other EPM-like applications that might be serving your business today. So this should get you started. It should kind of open your eyes of what is should be under consideration. But then ultimately, what we like to do is do assessments of various sizes to kind of come in and help guide you on that conversation and understand your situation better so that we can advise you on what options are out there when you're making a transition into EPM. So when it really comes down to a roadmap, what is the value of a roadmap? And one of the reasons why we really stress having a roadmap, and for any of our customers, is that technologies are coming all the time and they take new capabilities and functions. Decisions that you made in Hyperion 4 years ago may not apply now, or there might be a better way of doing it in EPM or a more out-of-the-box fashion from Oracle. So great decisions that were made 4 years ago might be poor decisions now just based on the way technology has progressed. And when I'm talking about a roadmap, I'm not just talking about implementing a specific technology. When we're talking about the roadmap, you need to understand a lot of aspects of what you're trying to accomplish, and technology selection is just one of those aspects. And then in many cases, you're implementing multiple technologies in order to satisfy the business. And so this is going to help us kind of understand what do we mean by a roadmap, and what are some of the areas outside of a typical technology implementation that you need to focus on. But in the end, you need to focus on the end state and have a plan to get there. And it might be a single implementation where you're just doing everything at once and you're getting it done, or you might be performing your implementations in more of an agile fashion and picking and choosing business capability to be implemented based on a priority. And we're going to cover that in this session. But in the end, there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to moving to EPM. And that's true of any implementation, whether it's EPM, ERP, HCM, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of moving parts, and it's always recommended that you have a partner or a guide that can kind of walk you through some of the things that you may not be thinking about today or even know are options for you in today's organization. So these processes are very complex to get you to the cloud. And there's a lot of decisions that need to be made, and there's a lot of understanding that needs to be made from a business perspective. And there are a lot of non-functional requirements, I would call them, in this aspect, where certain stakeholders in your organization are going to want to think outside of the business process that you're talking about. They're going to want to be able to do reporting. They're going to want to be able to have graphics. They're going to want to be able to report out to their bosses what's going on inside their departments. So it's not just the process of enabling FP&A traditional application processes. It's really going to be talking about the entire end-to-end requirements that your business is looking to do. Now, when you have any plan, when you're making any plan, you need to know where you are today, and you need a place to go. And if you don't have that understanding, you're not going to be successful because you don't know the direction to point. And if you can bring in knowledge or resources from other people who have done the journey already, that's an advantage. But you've got to have that strategic plan and checkpoints along the way to make sure that you're not getting lost. And you're going to hear this theme continuously through here. Technology is important, the process is important, but the most important piece is the team. You're going to want to have an A team in place. And that's going to consist of people from your organization, but it's also going to consist of people from outside that can kind of advise you, as I've mentioned before. And if you have a successful roadmap in place, you will understand your current capabilities today. You'll understand the vision of your organization, your department, you individually, to know what you're trying to get to. Those experts to kind of help you lead that way. And ideally, you don't want to be a trailblazer when it comes to an EPM implementation. You want to take a path that's been taken before, and the bumps have been smoothed out, and you can get a very quick implementation in and solve those business requirements without having to learn every pain point along the way. And again, make sure you have those right people. And so when you're talking about your roadmap, you need to focus on the people, then the process, then the technology. You need to do it in that order. The most important success criteria is always going to be the people that are on that project. The processes can change depending on the technology, and those kind of work in tandem. But if you don't have the dedication on your team, you don't have the right people on the team, it doesn't matter if you've got the best technology, it doesn't matter if you have the best process, you're going to be in trouble. So when we're talking about our roadmap, we need a plan to get you there. We want a plan that's proven, and just above and beyond the actual implementation itself, you want to make sure that you're good for the next 2, 3, 5 years into the future, that this plan is going to get you where you want to go, even beyond just the implementation of EPM. So I've got a busy slide deck here that I broke it apart so that we can kind of talk through each piece. But there are really 5 phases, 4 and then a review phase, that I recommend that you kind of go through when you're talking about building your roadmap. And the implementation of EPM is just within phase 4. The other phases are really kind of setting up the things we were talking about before, where you need to understand where you are today. That includes your team skills. That includes what's working today, what's not working so well. Maybe something's just missing altogether in your organization from a business process perspective. And you need to understand what the limitations of your current technology is. And that includes not just your Hyperion environment, but also your sources and other places that you're pulling data from. And you want to consolidate all that documentation into a place where the project team will ultimately be able to use it to understand where you're coming from. And you need to know where you're going. You need to understand the vision. And again, this might be coming from your executive team in your organization. It might be coming from your department head. It just might be goals that you're trying to accomplish. But you want to be able to compare where you're going to where you are to understand where the gap is. And that can be, again, people, process, or technology. And really importantly here, not everything is going to get addressed in the first version of a deployment. So you want to prioritize those changes or those requirements, or maybe they're just desires, but prioritize them and make sure that you're aligning yourself to best practices. There might be a desire to do something in your organization that just doesn't make sense from a best practices perspective. So you want to work all that out before you ultimately make a decision on what's the right tool for me. And in the olden days, we used to do this as consultants all the time. We would come in, we gather your requirements. Then we would say, all right, well, here's a great tool, but it only does 80% of what you want to do. And so we'll spend the next 6 months, year, however long it takes to customize that application to make it do what you want to do. That's not the recommended approach when it comes to cloud applications like EPM. They're providing a best-in-class service. They're providing that to a multiple group of customers. And if you're deviating from the way most customers do it, you potentially could get into trouble in future upgrades or taking advantage of new functionality that that vendor may deploy, including Oracle. So what you want to make sure that you're doing is when you look at those gaps and find out what's missing, you really should be asking the question, can I change my business process to match what the technology does today? If you can get that 20% gap to be 95% coverage now, that because you're going to change the business process to comply, you're going to set yourself up for a lot of future growth in those applications. Again, the new capabilities that I might have mentioned before, those things will be much easier to implement, in many cases automatically, just simply because you followed that philosophy. Then you'll focus on the actual implementation. And that implementation, I will caveat and say that it's very common that we'll see companies, they'll say, okay, we'll give you 20% of this person and we'll give you 10% of this person. They're all these subject matter experts, but they have their day jobs and they have to do their thing. But we'll give you some of their time. That is usually a recipe for disaster when it comes to larger implementations of anything, including EPM, because they have their day jobs and they are constantly in conflict. It's very common during month-end close that all the SMEs go away and we don't have access to that subject matter expertise because they're all doing their day job. We really want to kind of focus on getting the right people in the room, dedicated to the project, building out the roadmap, building out the implementation phase, and keeping them engaged throughout the entire requirements, design, implementation, and deployment phases so that they understand the application and can do their job as best they can. And so it's always our recommendation to try to free them up from their data job and maybe bring in other people to be able to uplift their work in the short term and so they can focus on the new technology. And that goes with IT as well. But again, you got to focus on the people first, whether that's training and getting the project involvement. And then there's processes that you need to be able to understand. So these are the test cases. Make sure you have them documented so that you can run them over and over again and validate what you're doing. And make sure that you have a good technology partner who understands the application and ultimately how it applies back to how you do business today. And what that understanding where you're coming from, that vision has to all kind of work together in order to have a successful implementation. And then finally, don't settle with, yay, we're up and live, it must be okay. Go back and take a look at your implementation. Go back and take a look at your company vision. Go all the way back to your current state as it is today, and then evaluate. Did you actually meet the objectives? Did you do better? In some organizations, the priority is just get to the cloud, and that's a much easier assessment. But others want to add value as you go to the cloud. And those are all decisions that need to be made when you're looking at the current state versus the vision statement for your organization, and then go back and take a look at that and see if you actually accomplished the goal. It's much easier to do all of these things in pieces because you don't necessarily know what's coming or what will be valuable now or next week or next month. And so if you have a partner who does this, and US Analytics, we do this countless times every month with all of our clients that we're working with. So we know what's coming. And so if you can find a partner that knows that and can see the future as far as what the process looks like, you can trust that process and understand that they're going to get you where you need to go because they've done it before. Now, when it comes to EPM, and I saw that many of you have Hyperion today, you have to avoid just focusing on getting the data into Hyperion. You have to avoid just focusing getting the data into EPM. That is certainly important. You want to be able to do your consolidations. You want to be able to do your planning, budgeting, and forecasting. You want to be able to do your calculations of profitability. But all of those activities are running the day-to-day. They already tell you what you already know. They're going to help you with the month-end close. They're going to help you build your plan and your forecast for next year. But it's stuff that you really kind of already know. And we incorporate training in that when you're doing your EPM. You'll have the business users really being able to understand the application, be able to use it. But as part of the roadmap, you also have to look at the other side, which is, now that I have all this data in my EPM applications, what am I going to do with that? And we've all been that with Hyperion. Then we go to SmartView and we start pulling data into SmartView and into Excel, and we start slicing and dicing. Everybody's got their own version of the truth because they don't have a master data management solution. We're not consolidating our hierarchies into a single form, so people are making their judgment call. You need to extend your roadmap to include a reporting strategy, an analytics strategy, so that you can look at that data outside of the application. You can enrich it from other sources as well and be able to make better decisions in the future than just the operational day-to-day of I got to build my budget, or I need to get the month closed. You can kind of look at future capabilities that you want to be able to do. And so the two of them go very much hand in hand. So you need both of these to be successful. I can't tell you how many Hyperion or EPM or ERP implementations that I have overseen where we did a great job getting the data in, but then guess what? We couldn't get the data out. We couldn't really understand the business processes that were happening. We couldn't enrich the data outside of the application. And so we pulled everything back into Excel and went back to the old world thinking. You need the analytics as part of your roadmap solution to make sure that that doesn't happen to you. Now we'll talk about the people, the process, and the technology considerations. So the number one reason for an EPM app implementation and the whole roadmap failing is because users don't adopt the system. They like the old way. In many cases, the people who helped you design the system are not the ones that actually use the system on a day-to-day basis. And from their perspective, the system works. And so why are we making a change? And so you want to bring in people like the super users. You could use the train the trainer methodology, but I affectionately call this the Betty role, only because there was a woman, her name was Betty. It was a manufacturing company that was implementing a large system, but she'd been there at that company for 40 years. She wasn't the director. She wasn't the head department head. She was just a member of the FP&A team, but nothing went by and nothing got approved, nothing got implemented unless Betty said so, because everybody knew Betty, trusted Betty, and they asked her. So you want to grab the Bettys of that organization and make them super users, make them train the trainer candidates, get them involved in the process very early so they can help you with the design. They can help you with the implementation. They can help you with the use cases. They can help you get the user adoption you're looking for. If Betty says it's good, people are going to use the system. If Betty says it's not good, no one's going to use the system. And so you want to be able to focus on the people. And that's why I personally believe the most overlooked and the most important aspect of an EPM implementation, and understanding that from a road mapping perspective, is making sure that you get the Bettys of the world involved. Get as many people as you can involved so that they will be contributors to the process and not be detractors. When we talk about business process considerations, this is the more traditional, I need to implement these business processes. This is how my chart of accounts is going to look like. This is how I'm going to do my allocations across the organization. These are the business needs. What the cost of the project's going to be from an economic impact. What am I going to implement this and actually transform the business process that I'm talking about, or am I just going to be implementing it with a new tool that's supported? Looking at how I'm going to migrate my data and integrate my systems. So do I need things in real time? All of these things are business considerations. And of course, security and my ability to keep that system up and running and be able to enable the business to stay operational. All of these things get contributed into the business process from a consideration perspective. And they are important. because ultimately, when you run your use cases, when you run your test cases, you're going to evaluate back to, did I actually help my consolidation process? Did I actually close the books? Those kind of things. When it comes to technology, I encourage people to not just think about EPM or just a planning application or a forecasting application. You have to look at the entire business process itself, which includes the source systems. So if you've got an ERP, you're pulling data in. If you've got an HR system that you're pulling data in, you have to look at those stacks as well to understand what the entire ecosystem or the application affinity, all of these other applications that enable a business process. Because it's not good enough just to move a particular application to the cloud. And we'll talk about different versions of cloud in a second. But you have to look at the entire application stack and move a business process up to the cloud. And if that means moving your ERPs to an infrastructure up in the cloud, whether that's transforming that ERP into maybe it's a SaaS application like EPM, and again, I'll go into what those look like, but you have to look at the entire stack of data as well as how you're moving data back and forth, because moving data in and out of the cloud is slow and can be costly. Many applications that run in the cloud, they might not charge you to put the data in, or they might. Almost all of them charge you to take the data out, and they make it difficult to do that because they don't want you to leave. And so you have to look at all of that when you're making a decision. And so you want to move all those applications that support a business process into the cloud, and we can talk about what those different parts of cloud are. So the history of cloud is very simple. What is cloud? Cloud is just somebody else's computer. It's not a complicated concept. But what does make it complicated is there are so many variations of what cloud is, it can kind of start stumbling you. And when you talk about all the different vendors that are out there and they have their own terminology, it gets gray. But really, from a traditional perspective, the old style is you have your data center, you put your servers down there, and you can store your data in there. And that's a pretty simple concept I think everyone is familiar with. Then they started doing some consolidations inside of your data center, where virtual machines, that kind of thing. Then the concept of the private cloud came out, where you can provision a server on your own. You can kind of get that up and running without having a lot of interaction with IT or with other departments. You can just kind of get it up and running, but it was your private little area to stand up servers. Then there's the public cloud, which kind of everybody uses the infrastructure, and all of this was driven for cost savings. The more that you can share, the less you pay. But the reality is everybody does a hybrid, where everyone's going to have data on premise. They're going to have data up in the cloud. They're going to be moving it back and forth. But this is not a uniquely IT concept. So the analogy I like to use is just from the auto industry, and there are others. But the traditional style is you buy a car, it's your car, you're paying for it whether you use it or not. But then people started thinking, hey, maybe I can lease or I can rent a car. And so I'm consolidating the costs of that car because I can spread it across multiple people. When I start talking about private cloud, like a carpool, and you're going to work in a carpool, it's always the same 4 people in that car. You're not sharing it with the world, but the 4 of you are sharing it, and it's your car to share. When you start getting to public cloud, you're talking about public transportation, even Lyft as an example for ride sharing. All of these kind of, again, drive you towards paying less while you use the car. And that is really what the whole cloud concept is. And so where you are on that spectrum is dependent on what are you trying to accomplish. Or do you want to lock it down, have it very secure, there's no possible way that anybody else can get to that? You're going to lean more towards the left of this diagram. If you're trying to get more to the right, you're trying to not spend money on things that are not a priority for your organization. You can save money and leverage. And that's what EPM is. It's a public cloud offering. Everybody's kind of using that. You're sharing infrastructure. It's segregated. So your data is not being shared, and there's security involved to protect you from a data perspective. But you're all using the same quote unquote executable. If you're familiar from a Hyperion perspective, you're using the same cubes. In many cases, but you're sharing it. It's been divided behind the back and behind the scenes from an Oracle perspective to allow you to do that. And so when we're talking about the cloud, those are the major characteristics, and really it falls into, for this conversation, really just two areas. You have this infrastructure as a service, which is I can get a server, I can get it up and running, I can install whatever I want. And you could do that with Hyperion today. You could have an infrastructure as a service server up in the cloud. You install Hyperion on it, move it up there, and you're technically in the cloud, but you're not in what is the software as a service realm, where you're actually sharing the code base. And that is why SaaS is more subscription-based. You're paying as you use it, and the costs are significantly less per user because you're paying a monthly subscription as opposed to owning the entire stack. Now, again, you're building out your roadmap, you're going to want a partner that can help you through all of that. Now, when you're trying to decide what makes sense from a cloud, there's no be-all, end-all solution for all of this. I rely heavily on a decision matrix, which is really nothing more than a set of questions and a rating scale. So you're going to talk about how important something is from a priority perspective and assign it a number to try to help you with the number. Now, it's not meant to be the decision maker. You are the decision maker, but it is supposed to help you guide what is a priority, what's important, and how do I rank the different priorities so I can come up with an idea of whether or not something deserves to be in the public cloud or the private cloud, or maybe I should leave it back on premise. But again, it's just a common set of questions and answers. And the number is really not that important. I wouldn't spend a lot of time trying to make a formula. It means, hey, if it's above 5 out of 10, I'm going to definitely do it. But if it's below 5, then I'm definitely not going to do it. What's important is the relationships between the different numbers, how it trends over time. So one example I use is if somebody asks me the question, how much do you love your wife, between 1 and 10? And if I told you, okay, and I'll say this because my wife's not listening to the webcast, but if I said 7, I love my wife on a 7 out of 10 scale, that doesn't really tell you a lot. But what is interesting is if I had a different priority, like how much do I love my car, and I said an 8, now you've got a conversation happening because I've just told you that I love my car more than I love my wife. Not true, but as an example. Also, over time, if I told you I love my wife at a 7 today, and then next week I say 6, you're learning about the priorities of the organization and what is changing. And so if I say security is important and I give it a 7, I ask, I need to be able to close quickly, and I give that a priority of a 9. That helps you prioritize. Maybe I should focus on a faster close, then I'm going to focus on security. Now, not all workloads, it's important to note, not everything should go to the cloud. Larry Ellison will tell you everything needs to go to the cloud, but not everything should go there. Also, when you're talking about your roadmap, you should be looking at, from a support perspective, what makes sense. Not only during the project, so I mentioned before, you want to free up your team to be able to do a lot of activities against the project and not do their day-to-day job and be pulled into the legacy process. You can use a managed services organization to keep the old system running. You could use the managed services to provide subject matter expertise as you go live and shortly after your project. But the ultimate goal is to free your team from the mundane. There's not a lot of business value in having somebody execute a backup every day of a system, as an example. People can do that in an automated fashion and for a lot cheaper when they can do it in volume. Where your value in your organization is how do I build a better business process? How do I implement that? How do I go faster? And as those priorities change that I mentioned before, how do I adjust to that? And how do I make the application adjust to that? When it comes to reporting, don't lose track of reporting. Everybody's going to focus on, oh, I'll just put it into Excel, or I'll just put it into SmartView, or I'll just build a report. A lot of the activities that you'll do in an EPM implementation will have ramifications to how you can do reporting. And in many cases, I've actually done an implementation where we prioritized reporting first. So we brought that to the forefront. So this is the reports I need to be able to get out. This is what my budget needs to look like. This is what my P&L will look like, whatever the case may be. And then I used that as a testing avenue for when I started putting my data into EPM. I could then run the report and see whether or not it was coming out the other side the way that I would like to. So don't leave reporting out to the end. You want to incorporate that in the entire roadmap well before the implementation to understand what that looks like. And some very typical tools, as I've mentioned before with EPM, FR Studio, Excel, we mentioned Smart View before. From the analytics perspective, the Oracle stack obviously makes a lot of sense because it's tightly integrated with the S-based cubes underneath the covers. But also Tableau or Microsoft Power BI are also quite prevalent when it comes to reporting. But all of these are based on the idea that you're going to take the data out of EPM and you're going to transform that data, rewrite that data in a way that you can slice and dice. And yes, EPM can do that, and the S-based technology is capable of doing that. But you start pulling out doing analytics when you're not looking at 5, 6, or 7 dimensions or 12 dimensions, but what if you have 15 or 25 dimensions and you want to be able to slice and dice like that? That's where an analytics tool will really help you. And when you're coming to your implementations, not all implementations are the same. A lot of partners will have accelerators that will help you get to that end state a lot quicker, whether that's documenting your applications, your current state, and having a process to be able to do all that, whether it's a common set of security considerations and configurations that need to be set up, and enabling single sign-on integrations, whether that's pulling data in large scales in and out, using API calls to get the data out for smaller use cases. And how are you going to get the data into EPM? You got an ERP as a primary source. How are you getting it into EPM? How do you get it out of EPM and get it into analytics? And then heaven forbid you make changes or you learn something about your business. How do you write back all the way to EPM, all the way back to ERP, and be able to understand what those lessons were learned and apply it back to the transactional systems? All of that needs to be considered in your roadmap. And monitoring or automation framework, how do you kind of balance all this? How do you know where the data is going, and is it right? And how do you validate that? What happens when there's an error? Does it completely stop your business process? Do you let it go through? And how do you even know something is broken in the first place? And move more towards a notification or alert process where if something goes wrong, you're told, not just getting an email saying, oh, by the way, everything worked. Those get buried in your inbox and don't add a lot of value. And since everybody's got a lot of experience here based on the poll questions around Hyperion, I want to spend on like the 5 types of analytics that are really important to understand. The first one is just reporting. You can do that in Smart View today. You can provide a single pane of glass. When you think of a dashboard, you want to put all of your key metrics onto a web page and be able to manage your business that way. There's a lot of great tools out there that will do that from a visualization perspective, but that's only one type of analytics. You also need to be thinking about augmented analytics. So it's easy to look at 100 rows and decide whether or not you're doing well in an area, or you've got the budget set out properly, or there's no errors in the data entry. But how do you do that with 1,000 rows or 1,000,000 rows? So augmented analytics helps you parse through larger sets of data and alerts you and says, hey, did you know that this one data point is an outlier? It's 400% higher than it's been for this department or this account code for the last 5 years. Maybe you should take a look at that. Maybe there's an error in the translation. You also want to there's also fit for purpose outcomes where if you have a very specific industry or a vertical, you can build your custom dashboards and augmented analytics to highlight those specific areas. And then one of my favorite areas is actually predictive analytics, where you take all the data you have in ERP and EPM and your HR systems and you pull all that together, but wouldn't it be nice to also pull industry data and what's happening in the world? We actually had a great example of predictive analytics for a education system where they were pulling move-in data into their systems to understand what the demographics of their student base was going to be in 3 years, 5 years, and what are the age of those children, what's their economic condition, so that they could understand what programs they may qualify for 3 to 5 years from now, which directly affected their planning process, because they plan for the demographic that's coming, not the demographic that has been in the past. So a lot of opportunities to enrich your data that way. And then real-time intelligence, and for those other industries that you're tracking things in real time, like traffic alerts, being able to understand where there's traffic and where there's bottlenecks on the roads, or if you need to understand where your materials are, just-in-time logistics, those kind of things, also fits under that analytics category. But when you're looking at your EPM roadmap, don't just focus on, well, I've got some FP&A data and I got some processes for FP&A. All of these things can impact the FP&A process. So it might be one of these, might be several of these, might be all of these that you need to incorporate in your roadmap to understand exactly what's happening for you. Now, I've listed some typical missed opportunities in the projects. Most of these carry around the fact that it's just not empowering the team to be able to do what they need to do, understanding the current state, understanding what the vision of the organization is, making sure that everyone is represented. It's very common that corporate might have this conversation, but you might have companies under that corporate umbrella that operate similarly or quite differently, and those were not consulted in how all of this stuff rolls up from a consolidation perspective, as an example. You want to do that data validation early. I mentioned before how reporting came up at the beginning of the project really helped from a testing and a validation perspective, but don't leave it as an afterthought to the end. A lot of these technologies will provide drill through, but the way you do your integrations matters in order to have that drill down. So if you want to use enterprise data management or FDME in order to do those integrations, in order to provide the drill down capability, you need to understand that up front, versus maybe just using a generic ETL tool to mass move data into another system that you're not going to need that drill down capability, those kind of aspects. Also making sure that you have your proper system integration testing and user acceptance testing, and don't be afraid to go in front of your user base and say, try it, create an account. Go in and adjust the budget for this year. Or even better is actually do a live close of the month with some test environments in order to see how that's going to work from a consolidation perspective and how they integrate. Don't be afraid to kind of do that, work together. And understand how your integrations are going to work from on-premise to cloud and back, and how, and again, that application affinity that I mentioned before, being able to move an entire business process up to the cloud is much beneficial than trying to just, okay, now I'm just going to connect all these systems together, because there might be some gotchas that get you around moving the data up and down, like I mentioned before. And some, again, critical project considerations that we've seen before. Metadata control is always a big thing, managing your hierarchies. If you don't have a DRM or an EDM type solution, those can cause problems because you have all of these hierarchies that may or may not match up. And when you start looking at applications that or analytics that pull data from multiple sources, you might have different definitions of what those child-parent relationships look like. So you might have product and product subgroups inside of a hierarchy, but another group might look at the products and subproducts in a completely different way. And then when they try to compare notes, they can't, because they haven't agreed to that hierarchy. Whether that's your data quality and how the data is actually propagating across, and is it clean? You can't do proper planning if your data is dirty. You got to be able to clean that up as you go, and where is the appropriate place for that from a data cleansing perspective. Your close process. There's a lot of systems that are involved and a lot of people that are involved in different departments. How do those all line up so that you can effectively close quickly? And what can you do in advance? Those are the kind of things that you need to be focusing on. And so there's a lot here, and again, it's a very busy slide, but I just kind of want to lay down some of the critical considerations from a project. But again, an implementer who's done this before can kind of lay out a much more broader set of conditions and requirements for you that may or may not apply to your industry, but you can work together on that and hopefully not miss something that is super critical for your implementation. Now, talking specifically, as I'm getting close to the end of my presentation here, and then we'll open it up for Q&A, we actually have a client here, DPR, who's a construction company, and we followed this roadmap process with them. So we started off with an assessment and said, all right, we're going to kind of understand your current state. We're going to understand where you're trying to go, where those best practices are, and then come up with a high-level roadmap and a strategy of not just an implementation of does EPM even matter or work, but there are other products that are out there that maybe you want to consider. But do that gap analysis, figure out what it's going to be, and understand how people and training and your business processes and how can you change those, all the things we've talked about in this presentation. How does it fit into what you're trying to accomplish? And, a lot of these pain points, pretty common in most organizations, manual reporting, and then of course there's errors with that. Inefficient processes where it's waiting in somebody's inbox to get done that doesn't really need to do that anymore, or it's an email that happened, or it's a manual upload process that just doesn't happen on a regular basis. Data integration, as I mentioned before, maybe it's not automated, and limited planning capabilities within the application because of the way you implemented it or because of the way your business processes required you to implement it. All of these things were particular pain points for DPR. So we came in, we did that assessment. We did just under a dozen discovery sessions focusing on their planning and forecasting and reporting needs in their particular case, understanding where they were, understanding where they wanted to go, and could they get there with their existing systems? Did they need to maybe reuse some of those or tweak them? Maybe they had to re-implement, make all of those conversations happen within the DPR group so that we can understand, and we did scoring metrics based on what software was out there. And then they ultimately decided on the eBPCS, and we implemented that for them. And it was a glowing success, and that was because we went back and we said, all right, in the end, that we're going to have to go back and look at where you are, what your vision was, and did we accomplish the goals for that? And we did. And so it was a glowing success, and everybody was happy, and there's parties in the streets, and everybody was happy. But it was because DPR wasn't our first go around. We've done this hundreds of times. And so we were always a couple of weeks ahead of the DPR team, guiding them along on where they needed to be in order to get there. And so it really kind of highlights the need of having a very strong partner and a very strong roadmap to help you build out with that partner in order to be able to avoid the pitfalls that everybody else has already kind of worked through. So you get those lessons learned just embedded with your partner. So in summary, a couple of points I just want to leave you with, and then again, we'll get to Q&A. But you definitely need a roadmap. And it's not just the implementation, but it's from start to finish. Where am I at? Where am I going? How do I know that I was successful? And it's more than just the implementation of the technology. It's focusing on the people first, then focusing on the process. Can you make those changes? And then focusing on the technology, implementing it in the right way that makes sense and that you can support it in the long term. You want to lay all that out and execute it, and understanding in the cloud and on-prem is going to be part of your roadmap. You're not going to be one or the other. You're going to have to take into both of the consideration, and what does that mean? And then ultimately, you want to have someone who's managed these multiple parts before, seen it before, done it before, been successful before, so you have a tried and true roadmap that'll get you where you want to go. And ultimately, the best people to do that are people who do that over and over and over again, because that's what they do for a living. So with that, I will conclude the presentation part of this webinar, and we will open it up to questions. Okay, I do see one question here. So, do you find planning migration to EBS is easier than HFM to FCCS? Any tips, lessons learned that you can share? So they are a very different migration plan. So migrating to ePBCS is usually more of a challenge from a business process perspective, because there's a lot going on. There's a lot of data elements that are there. And in many cases, most people who are moving to PBCS are not coming from a robust system, at least from my experiences. So you can make those changes, you can implement it, you can run in parallel with your current budgeting processes and make sure that you're actually working the way you want. The challenge with FCCS is you have to do it month to month, load all the data in, balance everything, consolidate, and then close the book, so to speak, and then move on to the next month as you go through each of your reporting periods. So I find that one to be more challenging because you have to do a lot more data validation. And of course, the answer that every financial person will say is, I want all my data for all time. And there's a lot of validation when you have to go month to month and go through the process through FCCS, and you can get that current balance being pushed forward to the next month, and then go again and roll up all of your transactions into it again. So I find ePBCS is usually an easier implementation, but it's a little bit more dynamic than an FCCS. So next question was, Some of our on-premise planning apps like CapEx are 300 gig in size, but 200 desk-based page files. Can UCS handle that? Where we need to rethink about redesigning our CapEx app in UCS. I will say that those are rather large sizes. There are capabilities to be able to split it up, and all the newer technologies around BASO and BASO cubes are available up in the cloud. I think the question is probably better suited as that you're probably going to be looking at it anyway, because there are limitations within the cloud. Again, you're using that common code base that everybody is using. So there are some limitations in that. And some of the size that is in your current planning app might be as a result of just functionality that didn't exist when you built it, but now it does up in the cloud and can be done natively. So I would venture a guess that you probably are going to be looking at trying to reduce that in size. But again, usually the biggest drawback, if you start exceeding the capabilities within the cloud, it's usually performance-based, not a question of whether it would work or not, but just how fast you can transact, or you can build your plan, or how you can build a what-if scenario for a planning app too if you're using that functionality. I will say thank you very much for spending time with me. I hope that this was enlightful. I definitely enjoyed putting the deck together and presenting to you. We're always available for questions and comments afterwards as well, and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to make your acquaintances. So I will wrap up and hand it back to you, Donna.
Thank you, Doug. You did a wonderful job, and we do hope that you found a lot of value from this. So feel free to reference, feel free to share with other members of your team and get those assessments scheduled with us. And then if you need any additional resources, we have an extensive library of ebooks and other webinars that we produce, where you can find that on our website under the resources tab. So we want to just conclude this webinar, wish you a great rest of your day, and hope to talk to you all soon. Thank you so much.